Welcome to the second episode of my Yakuza Retrospective. My goal with this series is to cover every localized entry in release order, along with the other games that aren't officially localized with fully functional fan translations, and the other games in RGG's catalog like Binary Domain, Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, and Judgment. In this video, we'll be looking at the original release of Yakuza 2 for the PlayStation 2. This video will contain full spoilers for the game, so I implore you to play it first. So this is going to be an interesting episode of the Retrospective, since not much is really known about the development of the original Yakuza 2. Its creation is shrouded in mystery, with most of the timeline of this era left blank or redacted in the behind-the-scenes books, like they wanted to hide something. I assume most of the people watching this video have only played Kiwami 2, which is the remake of the original, and I'm going to say something controversial about that game that most people don't want to hear. Kiwami 2 is a compromised remake of the original. While there is a lot of things left in the dark about this game's creation, there is one thing we do know about the original's development, and that is with the success of the first game, Nagoshi was completely unchained, and the end product that is Yakuza 2 is Nagoshi's unfiltered and uncompromised vision. Let's talk marketing. So as we covered at the end of the previous episode, Yakuza 1 didn't make the splash Sega had hoped it would in the West. So for Yakuza 2, they seem to have gone back to the drawing board to make sure that this game was an absolute success, and honestly, I don't know what they were thinking. It's not a hot take to say that the original Japanese cover of Yakuza 1 is the best cover in the entire series, and that the American cover of 1 wasn't the best, but I wouldn't say that it's bad either, or at least not enough to ditch that style for this. I really don't know who okayed this cover and who thought this would actually bring in more fans than the first game's cover. Not that it's an actual excuse for it, but the Japanese one seems to be pretty good. To go hand in hand with the questionable marketing comes the game's questionable presentation and localization. Just by looking at the game for 2 seconds, you can see the graphical downgrades from the first one. It feels like I'm looking at beta, unfinished versions of these character models. The same can be said about the visuals of the environments. It seems that Sega blew all their money getting the amazing cast of the first game, and with how the English cast was met with a strong pushback, Yakuza 2 has no voice acting in the cutscenes at all. This leads to instances where it's not really clear who is talking when it swaps over to the narrator, and has you sitting there for multiple minutes just staring at text boxes in almost complete silence. The weirdest part of all this is that there is still some of the voice acting from the Japanese cast during gameplay. Originally, I chalked this up to, hey, this was probably all they had recorded before they reached the deadline of the game having to be out, since they were on quite a strict schedule trying to get it out for December 7th, 2006. But after doing some more digging, it turns out there is a completed Japanese dub. They just decided for the Western localization not to include it. I can understand not doing an English dub, especially when the original was poorly received, was pretty lackluster, was a pain in the ass for everyone involved during its creation. Ideally, you would like the Western release to be sometime near the Japanese one, and the first game honestly didn't sell all that well in the West. So to justify localizing the second game, you're gonna have to cut some corners, you're gonna have to make some sacrifices in order to do it. That means when your options are to be able to localize it or not, you're gonna have to forego making that English dub. But that still bears the question of why leave us with nothing? Why actively sabotage the game's presentation? It just makes no sense. Most of the story is told via still images with long, boring text crawls on top of them. For me personally, this makes it pretty hard to get hyped for anything happening, because it just feels cheap with zero impact, especially when held side by side with the cutscenes from the first game. Even if you ignore the downgrade in visuals, the localization is pretty horrid. Your brain may autocorrect grammatically incorrect sentences or fill in the missing words because you can discern what they are potentially trying to say, but this is completely unignorable when it comes to the naming conventions of titles and ranks. As As you play through the story, you'll be given new ranks. These are just for signifying your journey and progress through the narrative, and don't affect gameplay to my knowledge beyond showing you what story beat you're at, which, as we'll get into in just a bit, is pointless since you only get to see them change when you enter a new chapter, instead of showing you which one you're going to rank up into in the pause menu at any time in said chapters, when it would be far more useful information. Your ranks start out pretty straightforward with Initiate and Brother, but then you and the people you meet have such weird and inconsistent names that don't actually make it clear where they rank on the ladder. For example, the localizers were really obsessed with this one title, Young Boss. You become a young boss. Yayoi is a young boss. Half of the new characters are young bosses, and I really don't know what it means. What is the difference between a young boss of a clan and the boss of a clan? Does that mean they're second in command, or someone in line to succeed the current leader? Can you tell me what the rank Young Korean Clan Apprentice Boss actually means, and how high on the totem pole they are? What's that? You can't confidently answer it either? Well, you're starting to see why it's pretty hard to connect and see the threat of any of these characters. We covered in the first game's video that a lot of the names were changed when brought to the West, like Kazama was changed to Fuma for some reason. Pretty much everyone has been renamed again, and honestly I think it's for the worst. I'm going to continue to refer to them as their true names, so try not to get too confused when I refer to a character as something different than the name they're called on screen. The bar really wasn't high for localization in the PlayStation 2 era, and still somehow they found a way to drop the ball. That means what serviceable story there is here, despite not being as personal or as depthful as the original, is completely marred and held back by sloppy translations. I don't want to spend too much time speculating on why they made these marketing and localization decisions, so let's move on to gameplay. One of the few quotes we have from Nagoshi about this game is that his goal with it was to go back to his and Sega's arcade roots. So to do that, they decided to make this game 2.5D. I feel like I made my stance on the first game's combat pretty clear in the previous episode. While rough around the edges, it still was very fun, especially once you got used to its stiffness. So I do think it is a real shame that they threw out the original combat for this. But nevertheless, let's go over all of the changes to really give a perspective of how Yakuza 2 was quite a departure from the first game. The biggest indication that this was a rushed job is just looking at the size of Kamurocho compared to the first game. It is at least a tenth of the size of the original. There is only a few streets with about 3 buildings that you could go into, that being the store, Tojo HQ, and an office building you go into in the story later. All of this together just makes the world feel really lifeless. I guess one of the things this gets around that was an issue in the first game is the really awkward loading screens and freeze frames when going from one camera angle to another. But even with this smaller open world, it didn't tackle the biggest issue with Yakuza 1's open world, and that was traversing it would get incredibly dull and boring because of how slow you were. It just really sours the whole experience when you would have to go from one end of the map to the other for a story mission, and one of the 3 taxis on the map doesn't go anywhere near it. In fact, this situation is even worse in this game because Kiryu is even more slow and lumbering than in the first one. Also, in their infinite wisdom, decided to add a sound effect each time your foot touches the ground. So you're going to be hearing the clacking of your shoes or sandals for the entire playthrough. The massive downgrade in the music from the first game is also very apparent during these moments. The game maybe has 5 tracks in total, which you are going to be hearing on loop for a very long time. And it's one thing to have good music being looped for a long period of time, but all of the tracks in this game are super repetitive. It sounds like some kind of stock music given to you in iMovie or Windows Movie Maker. You know, after saying that, that feels like an insult to the music of iMovie, because at least those songs can be catchy or used to comedic effect at times. This is just grating as hell. For all of the changes present in this game, some aspects of combat stayed the same, like your basic punches are still on square, but for some reason they decided to combine the combo finishers and your grab and put them both on the X button. One of the things from the original game that was lost in transition into 2.5D with less than a year of development was picking up things off of the street to use them as melee weapons. Weapons aren't fully removed, as you can still buy them from the local store and pick up weapons that enemies drop after beating them, but with the new system we'll cover in just a bit, the game really de-incentivizes using them. Thankfully, they added the ability to store your weapons at any time with the press of the circle button, but you could still only have one weapon selected at a time, and to change it, you need to pause the game, go into a menu, and select a different one. Your inventory has been reworked, where it's now just a list of things that you have, rather than the very limiting 9 slots from the first game. This also introduces the change to the leveling system. Now, instead of leveling one of the 3 trees that either gives you new moves, increases your HP, or increases your heat gauge, everything is now tied to Kiryu's fully customizable wardrobe. I can't say that I'm really a fan of this, as basic things like your dodge are now tied to one pair of pants, while grabbing and combo finishers are tied to another. Customization is cool and could lead to experimentation, but personally speaking, I think that customization should open more possibilities rather than restrict them. To be the strongest iteration of yourself, you have to make Kiryu ungodly fugly, when his starting outfit is by far his best. To add to the restrictiveness of this system is the fact that you could only get new clothes at the one store in town, which can be locked off to you due to story moments for long periods of time. You can be carrying around so much money dropped from guys you beat and have no chance to buy new things. Fun fact, enemies dropping money directly instead of getting it after beating them and then automatically adding it to your inventory was actually introduced in this game, only for it to be abandoned until the switch to the Dragon Engine with Yakuza 6 and Kiwami 2. The most probable reason they got rid of this for so long is the fact that the money can end up in areas that you can't pick it up due to the game being 2.5D and it being littered with invisible walls. There is also a ton of instances where the game basically makes you choose a loadout for a section and then you're stuck with it, but on your first playthrough you aren't going to know what you're up against, so maybe you choose the pants that reduce your damage and pick the shoes that make it harder for you to be knocked down at the cost of some speed, only to then find out the level is filled with gunmen, so the dodge pants and the speed shoes would have been better. But too bad, loser, you decided to choose something you had no idea wouldn't be useful at all here, so you now either have to suffer through it miserably or reload a save. Initially, I thought that heat moves were all but removed, with only having one of them which functions similar to microphone Kirby screen wipes, but instead of insta-killing all the enemies on screen, it would put them into a knockdown state, which turned out to be incredibly necessary for the basic flow of combat because most of your attacks animation lock you, along with having tiny hitboxes so you can only really hit one person at a time unless 2 enemies are like right on top of each other clipping into one another, and there are a ton of instances where the game throws too many enemies at you that you can't realistically easily handle them, and you can just be stun-locked until you die. This happens in both very open areas and tiny hallways. As a sick joke, they also decided to make the gunman enemies run incredibly fast, so it's impossible to catch them most of the time unless you use the heat move to knock them down. And to add insult to injury, this game functions like a stereotypical beat-em-up, meaning that there's only a limited amount of screens you can walk to before killing all the enemies, so there are tons of instances where these guys are just out of bounds in an area you can't see or can't touch them that are taking pot shots, removing huge amounts of your limited health bar, and you can't do anything about it and you can't touch them at all. I have no shortage of instances where this happened to me, and all this did was reaffirm to me that your unique moves should not have been tied to clothing, because most of the things you lose access to are just things that should be complementing each other and working together. In any other game, this would just be your completed move list that you would work towards, instead of having to make trade-offs and lose access to certain things to have others. And here is where the terrible localization strikes again, where things aren't really made clear what they do. The description for the black leather jacket, for example, says it gives you a parry, but unless the window to do this is somehow even tighter than a Perfect Royal Guard in DMC3, all it is just a block. If you read the clothing description, feel your spirit ease and strengthen, intimidate your enemies with your daring composure, would you have come to the conclusion that if you bought this pair of pants and equipped it, it would give you a heat move that actively heals your HP HP bar at the cost of 2 gauges. Well, that is the reason why I thought there was only one heat move for so long. It wasn't until I referenced a long play because I was absolutely dumbfounded and had no idea what I had to do to progress that I noticed that in the top left corner on the HUD, the word menacing changed to the word power. The game doesn't indicate this at all, that if you equip certain clothing that it will give you a new heat move, and if you press the right bumper, you can rotate around which one you have equipped. This is made so unclear and so conditional that I have no idea how someone is supposed to figure this out without outside information either being told by someone or seeing this in a long play video. After learning this, it actively changed my perception of this game's difficulty. In my original draft of this video, I said it was unnecessarily hard due to a plethora of things, like the only way to heal yourself was getting healing items out in the world from breakable objects, because you can no longer buy them from the store, and the only other time the game healed you is at the start of a new chapter. The healing items are also few and far between. It also doesn't restore your HP to full if you end up dying in a chapter and reload the previous checkpoint. It restarts you at whatever HP value you had when you hit that checkpoint originally, meaning that you can easily soft lock yourself in an area that you can't leave and have zero way to restore your health because you can't change to the pants that heal you and there are no healing items. Or if there are any, they're so far off, so deep into the level that you have to fight through so many guys that it's unrealistic to be able to get to it without losing your entire health bar due to the stiff movement and getting completely stun locked or shot off screen by a guy with a gun. Your shitty low range punches that rarely hit 2 enemies at the same time may really tempt you to use weapons like the guns or the long katanas, but weapons are tied to a new addition that this game does not explain at all and I absolutely hate, and that is the morality system. You thought that the 7th gen was plagued with terrible binary morality systems that were often contradictory, intrusive, poorly explained, didn't make any sense, or were just downright annoying. Well, in Yakuza 2, despite the seemingly rushed and cheap overall quality to it, it surprisingly has branching paths. To determine what path you're sent down is based on how honorable you are. Using melee weapons to fight against unarmed goons is dishonorable. To use guns is dishonorable. To hit your allies or unrelated people despite the game not indicating who they are, or the fact that you can even interact with them, is dishonorable. Be too dishonorable and you get the bad ending. You can lose and reclaim honor at any point while you're in said levels, because it only really matters when you hit the end point and what value you're at then. But this is a completely invisible, unexplained mechanic that I had to figure out even existed from some Two Best Friends Omicron tier game facts guide. The only thing that I ran into that even hints at this existing is a random NPC in chapter 4 that says, attack unarmed opponents with a gun, as far as I'm concerned, you're not a real man. But I didn't see this guy until chapter 4, which even if I figured out that this meant that there was an honor system, I would have never even seen it because you can get the bad ending with low morality in chapter 1. You can never see the true chapter 2 if you use weapons too much in the first chapter, where it doesn't explain it at all, or at least I didn't see any character that indicated this is a thing in the first chapter. This is the game's most baffling decision because it completely de-incentivizes you from interacting with one of the core systems if you want to see all of the game. What's that? You used weapons too much in the first chapter that's only like 10 minutes long? Well, you've become an outcast of the Tojo again, as you've been again framed for the murder of the patriarch, this time it being Terada, and you have hitmen sent after you again, in a level that feels incredibly unfair. This game would be infinitely more tolerable if this system was not present. Another glaring drop-off compared to the first game is the boss fights. Yakuza 1 had a ton of memorable and unique fights, and for comparison, in 2, outside of the first boss in the opening teleporting around giving me flashbacks to Shaq Fu 2, none of them really stand out. But I guess how could they with how lackluster the combat of this game is? They all maybe have a single unique move to them, but it's often just an annoyance since depending on what clothes you have is something that can make the fight completely uninteractive. Every fight feels like you have to cheese the boss in order to get a victory, rather than having a grueling fight of 2 dudes who, due to the cruel and unavoidable circumstances of life, must fight. Let me show you what the optimal strategy of this game is. Tap the square button with a slight pause between each tap, so you only do the first punch of your combo. This will stun lock every enemy in the entire game. I guess that is one thing Kiwami 2 is very faithful about, which if you do the dash forward and then press triangle, you can stun lock basically every enemy in the game. To close this video off, I will do a brief overview of the game's story. Like I mentioned a minute ago, most of the story of Yakuza 1 has been completely thrown out or just downright ignored. Haruka isn't mentioned at all, she's not present in the game at all. They basically redo a bunch of the overarching plot points from the first game, having Kiryu sucked back into the affairs of the Tojo again, as a civil war breaks out within it due to families trying to overthrow Terada and take over the clan. Depending on what honor level you get, you either are framed for the murder of Terada, or you save him in this attack and he is shipped off to the hospital never to be seen again, and you replace him, taking your seat as the chairman once more. To get the true ending of the game, you have to have high honor the entire time and beat the game a single time as well. This results in an extra chapter at the end where it turns out that Yayoi was a co-conspirator of the coup d'etat, and you show her the error of her ways and she kills herself along with the main villain. So, Yakuza 2 ended up unfortunately being a decent letdown compared to the original. I hate to be negative about my favorite series ever, but this game was quite the ball drop. If you asked other people, they would say that the series continued to drop the ball until Yakuza 4, as plenty of people do not like Yakuza 3 and wish for a Kiwami 3. I am not one of those people. I genuinely think that Yakuza 3 was a step in the right direction and showed us a form of Kiryu in a way we haven't seen before. So stay tuned for episode 3 of the Yakuza Retrospective. If you've made it this far into the video, I just want to say thanks for watching as always. If you really liked the video, please consider leaving a like, and don't forget to leave a comment because apparently that's good for analytics. If you really like the channel, maybe consider becoming a patron on Patreon. All patrons get access to videos a day early, along with a new $7 tier which allows you to view incomplete rough cut versions of upcoming videos. I'm now going to shout out my $5 and up patrons who really help support the channel. Bully, Akita Fishkiyama, Lucy the Fox, The Unthinkable, A, Bluntman, Elliot Morton, Jeff Ladd, Lotto, Nathan Redding, Nemphy, Quartz, Samuel Egan, Slemf Tingle, Walkman, Kiss Me Kenta, Cosmonaut Cola, Ben Johnson, Bergnut, Chichometrius, Dusty the Zombie, Ek Frazo, Filthy Finger 69, Fishkami, Justin Collini, Kevin Velasquez, Nicholas Pedinato, Onion Girl, Ruben Rodriguez, Starcasters, Star Fox, Some Panda, the FOE3, William Moore, and Steinco. Thanks so much, guys. As for what's coming out next, I'm probably going to stick to shorter videos, probably focusing on things on the PlayStation 2, just because these are easy things to make. One of the upcoming ones will most likely be Sword of Etheria, as I've played through most of the game at the time of recording this, and will probably beat it in the next sitting. My copy of No More Heroes 3 finally arrived, so maybe I'll start doing my videos on Suda51 projects, as I have a partially written script for the No More Heroes 1 video, I have all of my footage for No More Heroes 2 and Travis Strikes Again, and I'm about to start playing the Silver Case before I play No More Heroes 3, but who knows what truly is going to be next. Whatever it may be, I hope you enjoy it, and as always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.